The Freeway Killer looks into the eyes of a detective and explains, "The torture part was the most important." He speaks without the slightest trace of emotion or guilt in his voice, like he's telling someone about his favorite kind of fruit. The detective shudders inside. He'd gladly shoot this man. He's seen with his own eyes what he put his victims through. There is indeed perhaps no serial killer in U.S. history who caused his victims so much suffering before their deaths. You'll be repulsed when you hear what he did to these young lads, and yet his story divided a nation. Let's find out why. Friday night, March 1980, Southern California, USA. 33-year-old Vietnam War veteran William Bonin, aka the Freeway Killer, has just picked up 17-year-old William "Billy" Pugh. The two have just been to a party at Everett Fraser's house. They chatted for a bit at the party, drank some beers, and when people started to leave, Bonin told Pugh, "Get in the van, I'll take you home." Pugh's parents had told him not to get into strangers' cars. There'd been some horrible murders in Southern California as of late, and the victims were mostly male teenagers like himself. Pugh thinks this guy can't be the killer, and anyway, they've just been chatting at the party. The guy's cool, thinks Pugh. But as they travel down the road, Pugh realizes Bonin is far from cool. Bonin puts his hand on his leg, telling him he wants to have sex with him. Stuttering, feeling mightily awkward, and wishing he never got in the van, he tells Bonin he's not gay. Bonin slowly nods his head, obviously upset. The two then sit in silence for the next few minutes. Pugh sees his chance when they slow down at the next stoplight. He manages to open the door and almost get out, but Bonin grabs him by a shirt collar and yanks him back into the van. As the van moves away from the lights, Bonin's nostrils flare as he lets out an exaggerated sigh. He takes his eyes off the road for a second and looks at Pugh, who's now trembling with fear. He tells Pugh, "Do you know what I do?" Pugh shakes his head. Bonin tells him, not in a threatening way, but a matter-of-fact way, "I pick up hitchhikers like you. I do what I want to them, and then I torture them, and I kill them. I strangle them with their own t-shirts." Pugh doesn't know what to think. He keeps looking forward at the road, and then Bonin explains, "I usually do this on Fridays and Saturdays, because on Sundays, I take my girlfriend roller skating." The letters WTF are what are going through Pugh's mind. Bonin then says, "If you want to kill somebody, you should make a plan and find a place to dump the body before you even pick up a victim." Pugh, not knowing how to respond, just nods his head as if to say, "Yeah, great, thanks for the advice, mate. I'll do that next time I'm out murdering people." "Look at me," Bonin says. Pugh looks at him. "You and me are going to be friends, okay?" Pugh nods again as Bonin explains, "I'm not going to kill you because I like you. You're a good kid. And anyway, we were seen talking at the party." Pugh doesn't know if this guy is serious or out of his mind, but just in case, he lies and tells Bonin that his house is close by. "This is me," he says when they get close. He tells Bonin thanks for the ride, exits the car, and pretty much sprints up the driveway of a house he's never even seen before. This was William Bonin, a complete anomaly of a human being, as strange as men come. You'll understand soon why this scene with Billy Pugh is so important to the story, but first let's try to understand what made him such a very weird and wicked man. He was born on January 8, 1947, to Robert Leonard Bonin Sr. and Alice Dorothy Coate. He and his two brothers grew up in abject poverty in their hometown of Willimantic, Connecticut, population 13,000 in 1947. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Willimantic was the center of the textile industry, home to the American Thread Company. By the time Bonin was growing up there, it was a shadow of its old self, known less for its industries than it was for rampant substance abuse. Bonin and his two brothers were so poor that the neighbors would often gossip about how, in the middle of the night, the Bonin boys would sneak out into the garden to pull up potatoes and eat them raw and unwashed. The kids were always malnourished, wearing clothes way too big for them, while the father Robert was a violent bully who beat the boys' small frames with his fists and belt. He beat their mother senseless too. She drank all day in the house. She spent most nights drunk at the local bingo hall, neglecting her responsibility as a parent. In what was a vicious cycle of violence, her own father had committed various abuses against her when she was a child. Even after she married, he hurt her, and when he did the same to her kids, rather than fight against it, she allowed it to happen. If she'd suffer, they should suffer, was her unconscious way of rationalizing things. While she left the starving kids to their own devices, the father was gambling away every penny he earned. When he lost, which he always did in the end, he'd come home and beat the kids. Much of William Bonin's childhood was spent dreaming about escaping his house, yet he knew there was no place to go. The father eventually lost the family house on a bet. The whole family had to go live with the grandparents. Not surprisingly, young William got into trouble in school. He wasn't even 6 yet. After a stint in juvenile hall for riding his bicycle into some girls on purpose, His parents threw him into an orphanage/convent, where yet again he was treated to violence, this time at the hands of the nuns. It was in the convent where he had his first homosexual experience with a boy. Looking at the court records about this experience, it's very likely young Bonin at this time didn't know the difference between a violent experience and a loving experience. The older boy took advantage of him in the worst way possible. He was a frightened rabbit, prey. Gangs of kids beat him black and blue. As an adult, people would talk about the many scars on his head and back. Bonin would tell him that he didn't know where they'd come from, but it was no doubt from his days in the orphanage. It would come out when Bonin was an adult that those boys had beaten him until he was bloody. They almost drowned him in toilet bowls and cut him with knives. There had been witnesses. Young Bonin regularly feared for his life. The nuns never allowed him to contact his parents while he was in the orphanage. For the time he was there, he believed they were both dead. Why else, he thought, would they not have come visit him? He stayed there until he was 8, after which he jumped from the frying pan and into the fire as he was forced to stay with his sexual predator of a grandfather. At the age of 10, he was sent to juvenile hall again, this time for stealing license plates and hubcaps. Now it was the older boys who took advantage of him as well as one of the counselors, the person supposed to be helping him. Both adults and children had their way with him. Young William lived a tortured and twisted existence as a kid. You'd be hard-pushed to invent a worse environment for a child. In terms of sexuality, young Bonin's mind didn't know right from wrong. What he saw as acceptable was completely unacceptable. It was around this age when he attempted various sexual acts with his female cousin. Around the same time, his mother also had to stop him from going into his brother's bedroom during the night. Around the town, he was a delinquent, known for bothering younger boys. He was an outcast, and although as he got older his grades in school were okay, even quite good where math and science were concerned, he was troublesome. He never had any real friends, not like the ones he'd meet later in life, his dear boys. He tried to ease his mother's concern when he was 17 by getting a girlfriend. It was a charade, and she knew it. She was aware of his antisocial behavior. She saw how he acted in the neighborhood with the younger kids. Her son was damaged goods. She saw what was coming, which is why she pushed him to join the United States Air Force when he was 20. She also was relieved when he told her that he was now engaged and wanted to marry. It didn't matter that he was living a lie, at least he was trying for what was her normalcy. Nonetheless, handing a highly disturbed young man a gun and telling him to go kill people while adhering to the rules and ethics of warfare might not have been a great idea. The Vietnam War was now on. It was Bonin's time to go murder some so-called gooks. His time as a soldier is important. It would be brought up in the years to come by Bonin and by the authorities in relation to his sickness. So, let's look into this time in the Air Force. If you'd studied American serial killers, you'll know many of them cut their teeth in terms of killing in Vietnam. It's worth asking if this was the case with Bonin. Various criminologists and psychologists have often pondered if the Vietnam experience sent a lot of traumatized kids over the edge. The U.S. serial killer Philip Jablonski once told a pen pal that in Vietnam, he and the guys would throw captives from the helicopter for fun. Jablonski said Vietnam was indeed where he truly discovered his bloodlust. In court papers, his wife said that when he returned from Vietnam, he had changed. She said he'd always been mean, but now he was very mean. Jablonski had suffered tremendously as a child, just as Bonin had. After Vietnam, Jablonski was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome. He had recurring nightmares about his time as a helicopter door gunner. Bonin would later have a whole load of mental disorders attached to his name. The list of Vietnam vets who became serial killers after their service in Vietnam is long, consisting of around 40 men, maybe even more. It's since been debated if having a state-sanctioned license to kill normalizes killing when these soldiers return to civilian life. They were already messed up psychologically, and perhaps killing in the name of American freedom pushed them over the edge, especially as many witnessed murderous war crimes and other types of abuse. Like Jablonski, Bonin served as a helicopter gunner. He logged over 700 hours of combat time for the 205th Assault Support Helicopter Unit. That's a lot of action. He later said the entire experience made him realize that life was cheap and death was nothing special. He became a decorated soldier, pleasing his mother with his array of medals for bravery. What he didn't tell her was about the times he had relations with the local girls of a dubious age, or that during the Tet Offensive, he pointed his gun at 2 fellow American soldiers and made them do certain things to appease his ravenous libido. Despite this, he was honorably discharged when he was 21. He'd gotten a taste for killing. He'd hurt with seeming impunity, and now he was back in sunny California, expected to get a job and carry on as if nothing had happened. Bonin went back to live with his parents. One thing they couldn't help but notice was that their son, since returning from Vietnam, had totally changed. It was as if something had snapped in his mind, but he didn't want to talk about it. They were drunk half the time anyway. He took menial jobs such as a gas station pump attendant, but work was never on his mind. Now his entire life was about violence. He needed to carry on the hurt he'd enjoyed dishing out in Southeast Asia. What took up most of his time in the evenings was cruising around in his car, looking for hitchhikers. In the late 60s, the streets of California were full of hitchhikers. This was the season of the summer of love. The long-haired wild child would drift around the U.S. looking for adventure in whatever came their way. Teenagers were seemingly everywhere, mouths full of braces, wearing tie-dyed t-shirts and flared jeans, hitching their way to rock concerts, searching for freedom on the long and winding road. It was an ideal time for a predator. In 1968, Bonin in total picked up 3 teenage boys who were hitchhiking. He took them in his mother's white Chevrolet station wagon to quiet places, handcuffed them, and had his way with them. The more they pleaded with him, the more pleasure he felt. He didn't kill these boys. He didn't really want to. It was seeing how absolutely terrified they were that was the part he enjoyed the most. Other people's fear was like an addictive substance to him. In 1969, when he was arrested for 5 counts of kidnapping and various acts of sexual misconduct, he broke down and apologized. He told law enforcement that Vietnam had done something to him, changed him, but he left out what happened in his younger days. He was subsequently diagnosed as a sexual psychopath and sent to Atascadero State Hospital. It was there, a place where the fashionable treatment of the moment was electroconvulsive therapy, where psychologists attempted to divine what was wrong with this young man. They asked him about his many scars, about his experience in the orphanage, about his childhood of severe neglect. They said he was a manic depressive with sexual sadism disorder. He showed traits of antisocial personality disorder and was labeled as extremely disturbed. Yet he had a fine IQ of 121. To the experts, he was the victim. But when they were out of sight, he bragged to other patients that if he were released, he'd never leave a victim alive again. Bonin was smart enough to tell them what they wanted to hear. He was given experimental treatments and later moved to California Medical Facility, where he was badly beaten by inmates after manipulating and abusing younger inmates with mental issues. But he happily obliged to all the treatments and programs. And in 1974, the doctor said this man was no longer a danger to society. They opened the prison door, and out he went, grinning as the door clanked behind him. He played them like fools. He was far from reformed. Now he was angry. And after years behind bars and in hospital wards, he hankered for the euphoria that other people's suffering and pain had given him. After various low-key jobs and some study at a community college, Bonin again went on the prowl. With his parents at home, he'd set off in the car, and in 1975, he picked up a 14-year-old and said he'd drive the kid to his parents' house in the Huntington Beach area. Instead, he took him to a deserted field, whereupon he stopped the car and obliged himself with his prey. After beating the kid with a tire iron and strangling him with his own t-shirt, he heard the kid scream, "God help me." For whatever reason, Bonin stopped. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Sorry about that. Did I hurt you?" In what sounded like a sincere voice, he told the kid, "You know what? You're an all right guy. I was going to kill you, but I want to come back for you and use you again." He took him home all the way to Huntington, dropped him off at his house, and shouted through the door window, "I'll see you later." It was as if he didn't understand the severity of what he'd just done. The kid, who we'll talk about later as he plays a big part in the story, would be traumatized for the rest of his life. For Bonin, it was like they just shared a milkshake and seen a movie together. He was, of course, later arrested. He was charged with sexual crimes and kidnapping, telling the cops, next time, there won't be any more witnesses. This time, he meant it. He was going to be an ideal prisoner again. He was happy to talk about his rotten childhood, do the courses, and do the work. But once he got out, which he did, aged 31 on October 11th, 1978, he was never ever going to let someone live after he was done with them. In fact, he was going to up the ante. Their pain was his pleasure, and pain, he said to himself, must from now on be extreme. Back on the streets of California, Bonin met 43-year-old Everett Scott Frazier. They lived just a few doors away from each other. They both had similar interests, which were teenage boys. Frazier would hold parties at his house on the weekends. He'd supply the booze and whatever else they consumed, and the teenage boys followed him like he was the Pied Piper. Bonin was in his element at these parties. He was still on parole, so he had to be careful, but there was nothing wrong with having a few drinks. To others, he was in a committed relationship. He'd met Mary, a woman who beat her own child, so Bonin and she had something in common. On Sundays, Bonin took her roller skating. In '79, his parole ended and he tried to open a bar with his brother. That fell through, but he got by doing odd jobs, which helped him purchase his beloved 1972 Ford E100 Shorty van, arguably the scariest-looking vehicle in U.S. history. There was a lot of space in these things. You could do all sorts of things in the back of them. For Bonin, it was to be his dungeon, or as he later called it, his death van. He had his handcuffs in there, he had his gun, he had lengths of wire and rope, a knife, an ice pick, pliers, and even some sulfuric acid. In short, he was well equipped. He was finally ready to embark on the life he'd always wanted to live. Memorial Day, 1979. John Swenson is in the school cafeteria when he spots his 9th grade pal, Tommy Lundgren, in there. Lundgren, who's an avid skater, has a cast on his arm. Swenson asks why it's covered with a rainbow. Lundgren tells him he just painted it on in class. "You're crazy, Tommy. Aren't rainbows for girls?" says Swenson. Lundgren just laughs. They eat together, and then Lundgren rushes off. He tells his friend that he's got to go. He promised to meet some guy at the local skate park. The guy wants to do a photo shoot with him on his skateboard. He's going to be famous. This was the last time Swenson saw his buddy alive. There was no photo shoot. Lundgren had made the innocent mistake of believing what Bonin had told him when they met earlier. When his body was found, it was a shocking discovery even for hardened detectives. Lundgren had been bludgeoned, stabbed, and sliced all over his body. His face was ripped up. Lying nearby were his severed genitals. The crime scene looked more like a bear attack than a murder. Whoever had killed this kid had wanted to prolong the pain. The injuries were all inflicted ante-mortem or before death. Indeed, Bonin's enjoyment was the torture, not just the sexual aspect, which he never failed to go through with. He didn't actually enjoy the death that much, but the pain he caused and the reaction it produced. To the police, who'd seen a lot of depravity in their lives, this was another level. A few months later, Bonin picked up a 17-year-old. Again, he prolonged his death for as long as possible. The kid died from the shock of internal bleeding. The autopsy showed a foreign object had been forced into his body. The day after Bonin drove past a kid on the highway, he reversed and asked him where he was going. The kid, a 17-year-old, explained that he was from West Germany. He traveled by himself all the way to America, the land of freedom, of Coca-Cola, and great music. He wanted to see the famed San Francisco, see the bright lights of LA, but right now he wanted to take the famous trip down the Pacific Coast Highway and see other parts of beautiful California, to follow in the footsteps of the Grateful Dead, to see Jack Kerouac's Big Sur for himself. In Europe, this was the American dream. Bonin said, "Get in the van. I'll show you America, kid, all the best parts." And that was that. The deal was sealed. This kid was tortured like all the others, but he fought back. For that, Bonin stuck his knife in him 77 times. The next day, when the cops saw the body in Malibu Creek, they said it looked as if a rabid dog had got a hold of the kid and not stopped biting. Bonin picked up more victims, usually boys in their teens. He was always merciless with them. He tortured them all, binding, bludgeoning, extracting, biting like a wild animal, stabbing and strangling. The kids were found with blood coming from pretty much every part of their body. Each body looked like it was attacked by a wild animal. The cops now knew this could be the work of the same guy, and they might well have a serial killer on their hands. Soon, parents warned their kids not to hitchhike. Although the public didn't know all the gory details, even the police had never seen such savagery. They found one kid on State Route 99. An ice pick had been shoved through his ear. It was insane. In February 1980, Bonin committed 2 murders in one day. He tortured and killed one kid, but it wasn't enough. His bloodlust raged inside him, so he picked up 12-year-old James Maccabee, who was waiting at a bus stop in Huntington Beach. Bonin pulled over and asked what he was doing. Maccabee said, "I'm going to Disneyland." Bonin said, "I'll take you there." Maccabee's battered body was found a day later at a construction site in Walnut City. On March 4th, Bonin was arrested, not for murder but for violating his parole. The previous year, he'd been arrested for picking up a boy. With his past crimes, they should have thrown the book at him. Instead, he was let right out of jail. He didn't even bother turning up to his court appointment. A disastrous admin error ensured no one even went looking for him. He should have gone to prison. He felt untouchable. It was as if they wanted him to kill. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months passed and more bodies piled up. Emasculated bodies. Bodies that looked like a lion had savaged them. But lions go for the jugular. Cops knew that this killer was keeping his victims alive as long as possible. They found another kid with an ice pick in his ear. This kid had fought back, and he'd fought well. He'd even survived being forced to drink corrosive acid, and he kept on fighting. Bonin eventually strangled him. What was strange to investigators is that it looked as though this was the work of not one person, but possibly two. Bonin was one of 3 serial killers at the time working in the same area. All 3 were known as Freeway Killers due to leaving most of the bodies off the freeway. Randy Kraft, aka the Scorecard Killer, and also the Freeway Killer, murdered at least 16 young men in Southern California from 1971 to 1983. In a strange turn of events, he and Bonin would one day appreciate a certain pastime together. They would become friends, albeit in a unique environment. Kraft might have killed more than 50 young men. There were similarities to Bonin's murders, but they weren't the same. Kraft was smart and also openly gay. He'd even been in the United States Air Force, but in his case, his homosexuality led him to being discharged on what the military said were medical grounds. Kraft didn't have a brutal upbringing like Bonin, but his victims had been horribly tortured, bound, mutilated, emasculated, often found with what police said were foreign objects in places where objects are not supposed to be. He was a monster, all right. He wouldn't be caught until 2 years after Bonin was caught, so you can imagine the chaos that was felt in Southern California in those days. Patrick Kearney, the other Southern California freeway killer, murdered at least 21 boys and young men, although he wasn't a sadist like the other 2, and he was caught in 1977, so there was no overlap. Keep in mind all these serial murders happened around the same time in the same region. It made California seem like a biblical Sodom. To think, Joni Mitchell had sung in 1966, "My heart cried out for you, California." We think the Eagles got it right a decade later, when in the song Hotel California they said, "This could be heaven or this could be hell." The Eagles certainly saw the negative parts of glittering California. As long as Bonin and Kraft were alive, the state was hell for young men and teenage boys. What's even more disturbing is that Randy Kraft had an accomplice, but the cops never managed to find him. Someone else was with him when he was torturing these kids. Police never discovered who it was. And now it's time to tell you about a twist in the case of Mr. Bonin. He also sometimes had partners in crime with him. He hadn't been acting alone, at least not all the time. He'd killed twice in succession in March before he met Billy Pugh. You remember Billy, the guy that Bonin allowed out of his car after the 2 met at a house party? As Bonin had told him that day, they were going to be friends. Indeed, Billy later got back in that car. He actually helped Bonin pick up a 15-year-old runaway named Harry Todd Turner. After Bonin had his fun, he told Billy to finish him off. The body was found with 8 skull fractures and all kinds of injuries to sensitive areas. But police intel told them that 2 men of interest had been seen in one of the earlier murders, and that couldn't have been Billy. So who was it? His name was Vernon Butts, a low IQ petty offender who was later described as doing life in prison on the installment plan. Butts was an insecure, impressionable kid whose father had died when he was 9, but not before teaching his son magic tricks. Butts was obsessed with magic and the occult. He was an avid Dungeons & Dragons player, something that would later get chins wagging about Satan, as was common in those days. Butts was bullied and had few friends, so when Bonin came into his life, he was taken under the maniac's wing. Butts, a big fan of horror movies as well as fantasy, had now met a real-life horror figure. Butts would later say that after he was introduced to Bonin at one of Everett Scott Frazier's now infamous parties, it was the start of a good little nightmare. The 2 became lovers. Bonin was impressed with this young, unwashed chap, a veritable weirdo who lived in a fantasy world and seemed more than ready to engage in sadistic sexual activities. Butts was an extremely depressed kid. He had coffins in his house. He pretended to be able to talk to the dead. He thought about death often, and had, like Bonin, been in and out of various jails and institutions. Bonin would later say, "It was cool having him like me, made me feel real important. I never had no friends." He was an ideal playmate for a maniac. Soon, Bonin told Butts about his activities. He showed him news clippings he'd collected of his crimes and described in detail what he'd done to his victims. Bonin kept a scrapbook of his murders. He loved attention, and Butts thought it was pretty cool. His new friend was famous. Butts was there for the murder of the skateboarder Lundgren, perhaps their first crime together. He watched Bonin mutilate the kid. Butts attended at least 9 murders, maybe more. Sometimes Butts would do magic tricks for the victims to lure them into a false sense of security. He tortured and mutilated some of the kids himself, one time with a coat hanger. He told one victim that when you enter the death van, you don't go out alive. Butts would later claim that he was scared of Bonin. But the fact is, he was very willing to engage in extreme acts of depravity. It was said he followed Bonin around like a little puppy. He seemed to think he was in some sort of horror movie. He thought it was funny when Bonin told one of the victims in the midst of painful torture that his own parents had hired Bonin and Butts to kill him. Those were the last thoughts of this poor 18-year-old kid. Then there was 18-year-old Gregory Miley, another impressionable kid whose IQ was about the same as the average 11-year-old. Miley was with Bonin the day he killed 2 people. It seems Miley was reluctant at first and hadn't known what Bonin was going to do with the first 15-year-old victim, but he later admitted in joining in on the assault after first telling Bonin to let the kid go. Bonin said to Miley, "I'm horny again, let's go and do another one." And that's when they pulled up and offered that young lad a ride to Disneyland. So there were at least 3 accomplices, but it was Butts who put the most work and did the most damage. There was still more work to do though. In April, Bonin tortured and murdered 16-year-old Stephen John Wood, and 3 weeks later, he turned up at Butts' apartment with a 19-year-old supermarket worker named Darren Kendrick. When Bonin started hurting this kid, Butts ramped up the volume on the stereo and joined in. It was then that Butts learned what acid did to a human body and just how it felt to penetrate someone's head with an ice pick. He later told a friend, "You just hit the bone." Butts was a weirdo, so most people didn't take him seriously. Police had at this point formed a murder task force. They had some evidence. They'd taken fluff from the bodies, which seemed to come from a carpet. This was the carpet in Bonin's death van. If Bonin had lived in the real world and hadn't been so easily able to glide past the authorities with seeming impunity, he would have known that his downfall would come at the hands of his young accomplices. In May, Billy Pugh was arrested for stealing a car. While reprimanded, he and a counselor were talking when news about the murders were discussed on the radio. Pugh bragged, telling the counselor about the killer's modus operandi. He didn't say anything else, but to the counselor, he sure did seem to know a lot for a young kid. The counselor told the cops right away. When they heard the name Bonin, lights flashed in their heads. One of the early survivors, the one who we talked about earlier in the show, had actually called them and told them he thought the killer was Bonin. Police then interviewed Pugh. He talked and he talked, but he didn't explain that he'd actually been involved in one murder. It was just unfortunate that when the surveillance team was put together, Bonin was already out on the prowl for another victim. This time his accomplice was 18-year-old James Michael Monroe, a bisexual male prostitute who Bonin had not long ago taken off the streets and helped find work. Bonin acted as a father figure to this kid. He even took him skating with his girlfriend and let him move into his apartment that he still shared with his mother, a woman who you'll later see was still up to no good herself. This Hollywood streetwalker was now friends with a man he said was a bit odd, but a good guy. On June 1st, he discovered just how odd his friend was when Bonin told him that they should go out, pick up a kid, torture him, and murder him. Monroe thought Bonin was joking, but he also knew that there was a killer on the loose in Southern California who was now so prolific that there was a curfew. A day after Bonin told Monroe the plan, the day the cops were finalizing the surveillance team, Bonin and Monroe picked up 18-year-old print shop worker Stephen J. Wells. They all ended up going back to Bonin's place, whereupon Bonin said he'd give Wells $200 if he let him tie him up with a clothesline. Wells, who was bisexual and had not yet refused Bonin's sexual advances, agreed, only for Bonin to inform him, "I'm going to kill you now." Wells screamed and pleaded for his life just before Bonin strangled him to death. Monroe, in shock, just stood there. Bonin laughed and said to him, "What, have you never seen a dead body before?" They put the body in the van and drove over to Butts' house as Bonin explained to Monroe what he and Butts had been up to for several months. When they got to the house, Bonin excitedly told Butts, "We've got another one, he's in the van." Butts, who was dressed up in his Darth Vader costume, went to inspect the corpse and complimented the two on their fine work. "Be careful not to choke on your aspirations," would have been the perfect thing to say, but Butts just said, "Good job, Billy, you did a really good one." They dumped the body later that day. 2 days later, back at Bonin's house, Bonin and Monroe were eating hamburgers bought with Wells's money when the news about the discovery of Wells's body flashed up on the TV. Bonin laughed and looked up as if to see the heavens, saying, "Thanks, Steve, wherever you are." The two exploded with laughter, although Monroe's kind of laughter was of the nervous variety. Monroe later said he was scared for his life. That night, he feared Bonin might kill him. Bonin saw this fear and Monroe told him the reason. Bonin then said, "Let me tie you up, so you'll know that I will not kill you." Monroe wrote in a book, "I let him tie me up the same way that he tied up Wells. Then he told me that he could kill me and that there was nothing I could do. I started to cry and I pleaded for my life like Wells did." Bonin just laughed and said, "Don't be silly. You're okay. I like you." A week later, the police surveillance team saw a van pulling up to young men on the streets of Hollywood. These men, 5 in total, knew very well at this point in time not to get into vans with strangers. Alas, for many young men hardened on the streets, either they didn't have the option to quit their work as a male prostitute, or they just didn't care. One of them was a runaway named Harold Eugene Tate. This 17-year-old got into the van. Police followed. When it stopped at a deserted beach parking lot, the cops approached and opened the back door. The two were naked. Cops grabbed Bonin and handcuffed him. In the van, they found tape, knives, pliers, rope, and other tools. Better still, Bonin's scrapbook of murders was in the glove box. There were bloodstains all over the van, like something from a horror movie. The handles of the doors had been removed, so the occupants couldn't get out. The jig was up. This was an embarrassment to the police, who knew very well a clerical error had meant Bonin roamed free. Not only that, how had he managed to evade detection for so long with his kind of record? How many sexually depraved sadists with violent kidnapping records could there have been in Southern California? His record fit the description of the presumed serial killer perfectly. He just managed to fly under the radar. Bonin denied any wrongdoing at first, but changed his mind after the mother of one of the victims sent him a letter pleading that he tell her where her son's body was. Bonin talked and said he'd take them to the body, but police later said it had less to do with the letter than getting some food. Bonin later explained himself, saying, "I was dying for a hamburger, and I knew if I went out with the cops, they would get me a hamburger." The way he talked about those kids was beyond anyone's understanding. He showed not the slightest bit of remorse. He talked about torture like you'd talk about painting the house. A cop later said, "There wasn't one of us in the room that didn't want to kill him." An attorney who was witness to the confession said, "Listening to his confession was like sitting in a room of horrors. Here we're talking about killing kids, killing one and throwing him out like a piece of trash, and then going back to get another. It made me sick." They'd never seen anything like it in their entire lives. The way he went into every graphic detail without a care in the world. They certainly didn't feel sorry for him when they had to inform him his father just died from alcohol-related liver damage. Not that Bonin would have cared very much. Butts was later arrested, after which the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department announced Bonin and Butts are believed to be responsible for the kidnapping, torture, and murder of at least 21 young males between May 1979 and June 1980. Butts hadn't been involved in that many murders, and Bonin killed more people than that, but that's what they thought at the time. Bonin's kill count could have been at least 36. Monroe by this point had fled. He knew he had to get away from Bonin's house, so he decided to hitch a ride out of California to his home state of Michigan. As he was thumbing that ride, a woman stopped her car and said, "Are you crazy? There's a killer on the loose." He replied, "Shut your bleep, he's been caught." As she drove off, he flipped her the finger. He was arrested in July in Michigan. Miley came next, arrested in August in Texas. Butts refused to take a plea bargain and admit to all the charges. He never even had his day in court. He was found dead in his cell in January 1981. It was later said he stayed loyal to Bonin to the very last day. Miley and Monroe both testified against Bonin and both got life. There was some sympathy for the boys, not only because they possibly feared for their lives, but because they were neglected kids. It was also evident that Miley certainly met the qualification for medical mental retardation. His IQ was 56. He had suffered severe parental neglect too, later admitting that he hung around with Bonin because he was showered with gifts and felt accepted for the first time in his life. Pugh pled guilty to the lesser crime of voluntary manslaughter, but only after he agreed to testify against Bonin. Pugh only served 4 years. In 2014, Miley, who was then a grown man at 54, was beaten to death in prison, likely because the prison code demanded such actions. Monroe had fought hard to get out of prison, but so far he's failed. Just recently, a petition appeared on Change.com stating he should not be released. In his book, he wrote, "Do you all out there honestly say he is guilty of murder? Or was I in the wrong place at the wrong time? Yeah, I was, and I, for some reason, got caught up in this case. In all honesty, there could be some truth to that, but this case disgusted people so much that he'll likely stay in prison a lot longer. Public outrage will likely mean he won't get the green light at his next parole hearing in 2029. The hatred for Bonin was outstanding when he was in court, but the more information that came out about him, the more some people said he didn't deserve the death penalty. His defense argued that this man's childhood was so exceptionally awful that it should mitigate what he did. They said the way he talks about his crimes is proof that he is not right in the head. They also argue that he had frontal lobe damage, possibly the result of all the beatings he took as a kid. His parents were almost demonic, they said. He'd been abused so much that there was no way he could have adapted to life as an adult, not after being armed to kill in a war zone. Others argued back, saying there are many damaged kids in the world and the vast majority of them don't go on to murder people for fun. When it was heard that Bonin enjoyed nothing more than the sound of kids dying, and when he admitted that if he hadn't been caught, he'd still be killing, I couldn't stop killing. It got easier with each one we did. There was little chance he was going to avoid the death penalty. The jury almost passed out when they saw the photographs of what he'd done to those kids. The verdict was guilty. The judge handed down the death sentence, saying Bonin's crimes were gross, revolting affront to human dignity. Bonin didn't seem the least bit concerned, although he later protested about the verdict. Families of the victims said his lack of emotion in court was him taking great pleasure in seeing their pain. He was despised. No American serial killer in history has made so many people suffer so much. He tried to appeal against his sentence numerous times, but the death sentence was never commuted. When his execution date was due outside the courthouse, protesters turned up, singing songs and lighting candles in support of Bonin, a man they said was a victim as much as anyone. Not surprisingly, this didn't go down too well with the relatives of the victims. Fights even broke out between supporters of the death penalty and those against it. Many said Bonin, who was on death row, was known for his humor, his paintings, and the books and poems he wrote, and was a victim himself. People contended that after writing to him and visiting him, he had a caring nature. A writer who covered his life said he was completely the opposite of what everyone sees. This was a man who never showed an ounce of remorse for what he'd done, a man who told the mother of one of his victims that he liked her son most because he was such a screamer. After she stopped corresponding with him in 1990, she told the LA Times that his letters were all about him and his favorite TV shows. He never acknowledged that he did anything wrong. In her final letter, she told Bonin the correspondence was over, so if he had anything to say it in the next letter. He never wrote back. I was always hoping he would say he was sorry, the mother later said. Bonin talked about his pen pals with his death row bridge group, consisting of his new best buddies, the other freeway killer Randy Kraft, and serial killers Doug Clark and Lawrence Bittaker. The four of them had to be kept away from all the other inmates lest they face the consequences of the prison code. Bridge and murder brought them together. Bonin was particularly close to Bittaker, which isn't surprising when you learn that Bittaker's brutal sadism matched Bonin's. He was one of the so-called toolbox killers. Bonin was also able to tell Air Force stories to Clark, who'd served in the Air Force around the same time as Bonin, and it was a happy family of monsters. A day before Bonin's execution, he was asked if he had any regrets in his life. His answer was both surprising and not surprising. After thinking for a second, he said, "Well, probably I went in the service too soon because I was peaking in my bowling career. So I regret that I didn't get to go out and get the instruction and pursue that, because I've always had a love for bowling." He didn't seem to understand at all why this answer was unusual and unexpected. A day later, on February 23, 1996, he watched Jeopardy on TV while eating his last meal of 2 large pizzas, 3 pints of ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coca-Cola. At 11:45 p.m., just before he was injected with a cocktail of drugs in what had been San Quentin's gas chamber, he made a final statement saying in part, "I would advise that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously." At 12:13 a.m., he was pronounced dead. He was 49. The execution went without any complications, to which the governor of California at the time remarked that he had died in a much more comfortable circumstance than his victims had. How many people he killed in total is still not clearly understood. It's now thought that between all 3 freeway killers, there could have been as many as 131 victims. We didn't forget about Bonin's mother, who, as we mentioned earlier, was up to no good back when he was a free man, and also while he was incarcerated. After Bonin's funeral, it was discovered that she had been claiming his Social Security disability payments since 1982, taking advantage of an administrative error. She netted $79,424. The Bonin family was, without a doubt, bad to the bone. Now you need to see the one sadistic American serial killer we can say was just as bad as Bonin. The serial killer nobody talks about, real-life Candyman. Or for ultimate strangeness, watch How They Caught Serial Killer Ed Gein.